The courthouse had emptied hours ago, leaving only the soft hum of the janitor's vacuum in the hallway. After 15 years on the bench in Riverdale, late nights like these had become part of his routine. His colleagues often teased him about his dedication, but to Judge Wilson, every case deserved his full attention. He rubbed his tired eyes and glanced at the clock on the wall, 9:45 p.m. His wife would be wondering where he was, though she had grown used to his late hours over their 30 years of marriage. He picked up his phone to text her that he was finally heading home. The courthouse parking lot was nearly empty as Judge Wilson walked to his car. At 55, he moved with the confident stride of a man who had earned his place in the world through hard work and determination. The moonlight reflected off his dark blue Mercedes, a car he had purchased not to show off, but as a small reward for decades of public service. He had grown up with very little, the son of a factory worker and a school lunch lady, and never forgot the lessons of humility they taught him. As he drove through downtown Riverdale, he couldn't help but feel a deep connection to the town. On his left was the community center where he had started a mentorship program for teenagers who needed guidance. The program had helped hundreds of kids stay in school and out of trouble. On his right was the park where he often spoke at community events, always making time to listen to the concerns of the people he served. The streets became quieter as he turned into Pine Hills, the neighborhood where he had lived for the past 10 years. It was one of the nicer areas in town, with large oak trees lining the streets and well-kept houses set back from the road. When he and his wife had first moved in, they were among the only black families in the area. Over time, a few more diverse families had joined the neighborhood, though not as many as Judge Wilson had hoped. He smiled as he drove past the Chen family's house, remembering how they had brought him homemade dumplings when they first moved in last year. A little further down, old Mr. Thompson was still up, watching television in his front room, as he did every night until midnight. The neighborhood had its own rhythm, and Judge Wilson had become part of its steady beat. The radio played softly in the background, a jazz station that helped him unwind after long days. He thought about the cases he'd reviewed that evening, a property dispute between neighbors, a complicated divorce settlement, and a young man facing his third drug offense. That last one troubled him. The young man reminded him of his own nephew, who had struggled before finding his way. Judge Wilson made a mental note to look into alternative sentencing options that might help rather than just punish. His mind drifted to the weekend ahead. His daughter would be visiting from college with her roommate, and his son had promised to come for Sunday dinner with his new girlfriend. Family time was precious to Judge Wilson, a sacred space where titles and work stayed at the door. The Mercedes purred as he turned onto Oakwood Drive, just 3 blocks from home. The streetlights cast long shadows across the road. Judge Wilson adjusted his rearview mirror, a habit from years of driving. In that brief moment, flashing lights suddenly appeared behind him, painting his car in alternating red and blue. His heart sank a little. Even after all these years, after all his accomplishments, that flash of police lights behind him still triggered a familiar knot in his stomach. He took a deep breath and carefully pulled over, making sure to stop in a well-lit area. As he put the car in park, he reminded himself of the routine he had practiced countless times: move slowly, keep hands visible, speak calmly. Judge Wilson watched in his side mirror as 2 officers approached his car. He didn't recognize either of them, which was unusual in a town where he knew most of the police force. The taller officer had his hand resting near his holster, his face set in a stern expression that made Judge Wilson's skin prickle with unease. This routine traffic stop was about to become anything but routine. Firmly on the steering wheel, visible at the 10 and 2 positions. The police cruiser's spotlight blazed through his rear window, turning the inside of his car bright as day. License and registration, the taller officer demanded without a greeting. His nameplate read Officer Turner. The second officer, younger with nervous eyes, hung back slightly, hand also resting near his weapon. "Good evening, officers," Judge Wilson replied, his voice steady despite the flutter in his chest. "May I ask why I've been pulled over?" "Taillights out," Officer Turner said curtly. "License and registration." Judge Wilson frowned slightly. That couldn't be right. He just had his car serviced last week, and everything had been in perfect working order. I need to reach for my wallet in my back pocket and my registration in the glove box, he explained carefully. Just move slowly, Turner ordered, his eyes tracking every movement. Judge Wilson reached for his wallet with deliberate care. As he handed over his license, he said, "I'm Judge Wilson from the county courthouse. I've lived in this neighborhood for 10 years. He hoped the information might ease the tension. The officer barely glanced at the license. "Registration," he repeated. "It's in my glove compartment," Judge Wilson explained again. As he reached toward the passenger side, Officer Turner suddenly tensed and put his hand directly on his holster. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he barked. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably. "Turner," he just said. "I don't care what he said," Turner cut him off. "Sir, step out of the vehicle." Judge Wilson felt a chill run down his spine. He'd heard stories like this from friends, from community members who came to his outreach programs, even from his own son. But it had been years since he'd been treated with such blatant disrespect during a traffic stop. "Officer, I've informed you that my registration is in the glove compartment." "I'm simply trying to comply with your request," he said, keeping his voice level despite the anger building inside him. "Out of the car. Now." Turner's voice left no room for discussion. Swallowing his pride, Judge Wilson opened his door slowly and stepped out into the harsh glare of the headlights. The asphalt felt cold through the thin soles of his dress shoes. He stood tall, his 6-foot frame still imposing despite his age. "Place your hands on the hood," Turner ordered. "Is this really necessary?" Judge Wilson asked, even as he complied. The metal felt cool against his palms. "My taillight was fine when I left the courthouse." "Oh, you work at the courthouse?" Turner's tone was mocking now. "What do you do there, janitor?" The younger officer looked distinctly uncomfortable. "Turner, maybe we should." "Quiet, Ramirez, I'm handling this." Turner circled around Judge Wilson like a predator. "What are you doing in this neighborhood at this hour?" "As I already told you, I live here." "My house is 3 blocks away on Maple Street," Judge Wilson replied, his patience wearing thin. "And for the record, I'm not a janitor. I'm a circuit court judge." Turner laughed. "Right, and I'm the governor." He leaned closer. "Let me see some ID that proves that." "My judicial ID is in my wallet, which you're holding," Judge Wilson pointed out. As Turner flipped through the wallet with clear skepticism, headlights approached from down the street. A car slowed as it passed, the driver clearly curious about the scene. Judge Wilson recognized Mrs. Patel's minivan. She was the mother of one of the teens in his mentorship program, and she worked as a paralegal at a law firm downtown. The minivan pulled over just ahead of them. Turner straightened up, irritation flashing across his face. "Stay here," he ordered Judge Wilson before walking toward Mrs. Patel's vehicle. "Ma'am, please continue driving. This is police business." From where he stood, Judge Wilson could see Mrs. Patel's confused expression. She rolled down her window but didn't drive away. "Judge Wilson," she called out. "Is everything okay?" Turner stopped in his tracks, turning back to look at Judge Wilson with new eyes. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Officer Ramirez stepped forward. "Sir, are you really Judge Wilson? The one who spoke at our academy graduation last spring?" Before Judge Wilson could answer, more lights appeared in nearby houses. Word traveled fast in tight-knit neighborhoods. A door opened across the street, and a man in pajamas and a robe stepped onto his porch. "What's going on over there?" the man called out. "Judge, is that you?" Turner's face had gone from confident to confused to something that looked remarkably like fear. Judge Wilson stood straight, no longer leaning against the car. "Yes, it's me," he called back to his neighbor. "Just a misunderstanding with these officers." His throat and handed back Judge Wilson's wallet, suddenly all business. "Sorry for the inconvenience, sir. We've had some break-ins reported in this area." Judge Wilson took his wallet, noticing how Turner conveniently avoided making eye contact. "Break-ins? That's interesting. As a resident and the head of our neighborhood watch, I haven't heard about any recent incidents." More neighbors were coming outside now. An elderly couple in matching bathrobes stood on their lawn across the street. The husband called out, "Everything all right, Judge?" "We're sorting it out, Mr. Lee," Judge Wilson replied, his voice carrying in the quiet night. Mrs. Patel had stepped out of her minivan. "Judge Wilson has been helping my son prepare for college applications," she explained to Officer Ramirez. "He runs the youth mentorship program downtown." Turner's face reddened. "Ma'am, please return to your vehicle. This is a traffic stop." "A traffic stop for what?" Judge Wilson asked, his patience finally running thin. "You claimed my taillight was out. I'd like to see this alleged issue myself." Ramirez, the younger officer, seemed increasingly uncomfortable. He shifted from foot to foot before finally speaking up. "Sir, if you don't mind, could you show me your judicial ID again? I think I remembered you from our graduation ceremony." Judge Wilson removed the ID card from his wallet and handed it to Ramirez, whose eyes widened in recognition. "Turner," Ramirez muttered, nudging his partner. "This is really him. This is the judge who gave that speech about community policing." Turner barely glanced at the ID. Instead, he walked to the back of Judge Wilson's car, examining the taillights. Both glowed bright red in the night. He tapped one with his knuckle, then turned back with a strained smile. "Looks like it's working now. Must have been a temporary short." "Both lights are functioning perfectly," Judge Wilson stated firmly. "Just as they were when you pulled me over." By now, at least half a dozen neighbors had gathered at a respectful distance. Mrs. Patel had taken out her phone, though whether she was recording or calling someone wasn't clear. The crowd's presence seemed to make Turner increasingly nervous. "Look, there appears to have been a misunderstanding," Turner said, lowering his voice. "You're free to go, sir." "A misunderstanding?" Judge Wilson repeated, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Officer Turner, you pulled me over without cause, refused to believe my identity despite proper identification, ordered me out of my vehicle, and suggested I couldn't possibly live in this neighborhood. What part of that was a misunderstanding?" Turner's jaw tightened. "Sir, I was simply following protocol for an officer safety issue when you reached for the glove compartment suddenly." "After I clearly stated what I was doing," Judge Wilson countered. "I've been on the bench for 15 years, officer. I've heard every excuse in the book, and that one doesn't hold water." Ramirez stepped forward. "Judge Wilson, on behalf of the department, I want to apologize for any discomfort this situation has caused." Judge Wilson nodded at the young officer, appreciating his attempt to salvage the situation, but his focus remained on Turner. "Your badge number, please." "Sir, that's not necessary," Turner started. "Your badge number," Judge Wilson repeated calmly. "Mr. Lee called from across the street. Need me to call the chief judge? My grandson plays Little League with his boy." Turner reluctantly recited his badge number, which Judge Wilson committed to memory immediately. "I'd also like your dash cam and body cam footage preserved," Judge Wilson added. "I'm sure the department would want a complete record of this interaction." Officer Ramirez nodded. "Yes, sir. I'll make sure of it personally." A heavy-set man with gray at his temples stepped out, frowning as he surveyed the scene. "Lieutenant Baker." Judge Wilson greeted him with a nod. "Judge Wilson." The lieutenant looked confused, then concerned. "What's going on here?" "Your officers pulled me over for a supposedly broken taillight that is clearly functioning properly," Judge Wilson explained. From there, things escalated in a most unfortunate manner. Lieutenant Baker's expression darkened as he looked at Turner. "We'll discuss this back at the station." He turned to Judge Wilson. "I'm very sorry about this, Your Honor." Judge Wilson nodded but didn't smile. "I appreciate that, Lieutenant. But this isn't about titles or apologies. This is about a pattern that has to stop." The gathered neighbors murmured in agreement. Mrs. Patel stepped forward. "Judge Wilson helped my son stay out of trouble when no one else could reach him. He volunteers his weekends to mentor kids that everyone else has given up on. And this is how he gets treated in his own neighborhood." Lieutenant Baker looked genuinely distressed. "I assure you, this isn't how our department operates." "But it is," Judge Wilson said quietly. "Maybe not with you, maybe not with every officer, but it happens. And it keeps happening because good people turn a blind eye." The weight of his words settled over the small crowd. Even Turner had the decency to look ashamed. "We should talk about this properly," Lieutenant Baker suggested. "Not here in the street. I agree, Judge Wilson said. Tomorrow morning, in my chambers, bring the chief. As the officers prepared to leave, Judge Wilson turned to his neighbors with a tired smile. Thank you all for your concern, but please, go back to your homes. It's late, and this matter will be addressed properly tomorrow. The crowd slowly dispersed, though several neighbors made a point of approaching Judge Wilson first, touching his arm or patting his shoulder in silent support. Mrs. Patel waited until the others had gone before speaking. This isn't right, she said softly. After everything you do for this town. Judge Wilson sighed. Justice isn't only found in courtrooms, Mrs. Patel. Sometimes it has to be pursued in the streets, one incident at a time. Account of the incident with a mixture of anger and resigned familiarity. You should have called me, she had said, squeezing his hand. But I'm glad the neighbors were there. By morning, his phone was buzzing constantly. News traveled fast in small towns, and by 7 a.m., 3 local reporters had left messages asking for comments. He declined them all. This wasn't about media attention, it was about something much more important. Judge Wilson arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual, nodding to the security guards who greeted him with the same respect they always had. But today felt different. He noticed how they looked at him, with concern, with questions in their eyes that they weren't asking. Morning, Your Honor, said the court clerk as he passed her desk. Chief Thomas called. He'll be here at 9 with Lieutenant Baker. She hesitated, then added, Everyone's talking about what happened last night. I'm sure they are, Mrs. Green, Judge Wilson replied with a tired smile. He entered his chambers and closed the door, grateful for a moment of quiet before the coming storm. At precisely 9 o'clock, there was a knock on his door. Chief Thomas entered first, a tall man with a military bearing who had run the police department for 8 years. Behind him came Lieutenant Baker, looking much more uncomfortable than he had the night before. To Judge Wilson's surprise, a third man entered, the mayor. Judge Wilson, the mayor began, extending his hand. I want to personally apologize for last night's incident. When the chief called me this morning, I was appalled. Judge Wilson shook his hand but remained standing. He hadn't invited anyone to sit yet. I appreciate your concern, Mayor, but I'm more interested in actions than apologies. Chief Thomas stepped forward, his face grave. I've reviewed the body camera footage. Officer Turner's conduct was completely unacceptable. He's been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. That's a start, Judge Wilson acknowledged, but it's not enough. He finally gestured for them to sit. Let me tell you what I experienced last night, not as a judge, but as a black man in your town. For the next 15 minutes, he spoke without interruption. He described each moment of the encounter, from the initial stop to Turner's condescending tone, from the assumption he couldn't possibly be a judge to the sudden change when witnesses appeared. He described the familiar knot of fear that had formed in his stomach, the same one he felt 30 years ago as a law student when police stopped him for no reason. This isn't about one officer, Judge Wilson concluded. It's about a culture that allows this to happen in the first place. The chief looked deeply troubled. Judge Wilson, I want you to know that we've had mandatory bias training for the past 3 years. And yet, here we are, Judge Wilson replied evenly. Training is meaningless without accountability. The mayor leaned forward. What do you recommend, Judge? Your opinion carries weight in this community. Before Judge Wilson could answer, there was another knock at the door. Mrs. Green poked her head in. I'm sorry to interrupt, Your Honor, but there's something you should see. She opened the door wider, revealing the courthouse lobby filled with people. Court staff, lawyers, and ordinary citizens had gathered in an impromptu show of support. At the front stood Mrs. Patel and her son. Beside them was Officer Ramirez, out of uniform, shifting nervously on his feet. They've been arriving all morning, Mrs. Green explained, and Officer Ramirez insists on speaking with you. The sight caught Judge Wilson by surprise. He hadn't expected this kind of response. Send Officer Ramirez in, he decided. The rest can wait. The young officer entered, cap in hand. Judge Wilson, I couldn't sleep last night. What happened was wrong, and I should have done more to stop it. His words came in a rush. Turner has a history of this behavior. There have been complaints before, but nothing ever sticks because he hesitated. Because no one with enough influence has been on the receiving end, Judge Wilson finished for him. Ramirez nodded. I'm willing to go on record about what I've seen, not just last night, but other incidents too. Would it have made a difference? Ramirez challenged. The tension in the room was palpable. Judge Wilson moved to the window, looking down at the gathering crowd below. Among them, he spotted his court reporter, his bailiff, lawyers from both the defense and prosecution. He even recognized faces from his mentorship program, young people who looked up to him, who counted on him to be an example. He turned back to the room. Here's what's going to happen. Chief, I want a complete review of Officer Turner's record. Every traffic stop, every arrest, every complaint. He paused. And I want the same for any officer with similar patterns. That's a tall order, the chief protested. It's necessary, the mayor interjected, surprising everyone. Judge Wilson is right. We need to address this systematically. Judge Wilson nodded. And I want to establish a civilian review board with actual authority, not just window dressing. People from all parts of our community should have a voice in how they're policed. Lieutenant Baker, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke. For what it's worth, Judge, most of us respect the hell out of you. What happened last night doesn't represent who we try to be. Then help me make sure it doesn't happen again, Judge Wilson replied. Not to me, not to anyone in this town. He looked at Ramirez. It takes courage to speak up. The system doesn't always reward that courage. Ramirez straightened his shoulders. Some things are more important than promotions, sir. Judge Wilson smiled for the first time that morning. Indeed they are. He walked to the door and opened it, facing the crowd that had gathered. Their conversations hushed as they saw him. Then, unexpectedly, someone began to applaud. Others joined in until the sound filled the lobby. As he stood there, Judge Wilson felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, but also the strength of community surrounding him. What had begun as a humiliating traffic stop had transformed into something powerful, a moment of recognition, not just of his position, but of a shared determination to do better. The real work was just beginning. Wouldn't stop ringing. Local news reporters camped outside the courthouse, hoping to catch a statement. His secretary fielded dozens of calls from concerned citizens, fellow judges, and even state officials who had caught wind of the incident. Judge Wilson sat at his desk, tie loosened, reviewing the cases scheduled for his afternoon session. Despite everything, the wheels of justice needed to keep turning. There were people counting on him to be fair and focused, regardless of his personal struggles. A soft knock at the door broke his concentration. It was Mrs. Green again. Your Honor, I've rescheduled your afternoon docket as you requested. But there's someone here who insists on seeing you. She lowered her voice. It's Officer Turner's wife. Judge Wilson looked up in surprise. This was unexpected. Send her in, he said after a moment's hesitation. A slender woman with tired eyes entered the room. She clutched her purse tightly in front of her like a shield. Mrs. Turner, Judge Wilson greeted her, rising from his seat. Please sit down. She remained standing. I won't take much of your time, Judge. She took a deep breath. I wanted to apologize for my husband's behavior. What he did was wrong. Judge Wilson gestured again to the chair. Please sit, this can't be easy for you. This time she accepted, perching on the edge of the seat. They're saying he'll be fired. That there's going to be an investigation into all his past arrests. There will be a thorough review, Judge Wilson confirmed. Your husband's actions last night weren't isolated, from what I understand. Mrs. Turner nodded slowly. He wasn't always like this. When we first met, he wanted to be an officer to help people. She looked down at her hands. Then his partner was shot during a traffic stop 3 years ago. He survived, but Tom changed after that. Became harder, more suspicious. Judge Wilson listened carefully. He'd seen it before. How trauma could twist a person's perspective, how fear could curdle into prejudice. That doesn't excuse his behavior, she added quickly. I've tried to talk to him about it. So have others. He won't listen. There was a moment of silence between them. Outside the window, life continued. Cars passing, people walking, oblivious to the quiet conversation that might help shape their community's future. "Why did you come here today, Mrs. Turner?" Judge Wilson finally asked. "Because someone needed to say sorry, because I have 2 teenage sons who need to learn that actions have consequences, even when those actions come from fear." She looked directly at him now. "And because I heard about the youth program you run. Tom and I have been worried about our older boy. He's been getting into trouble, skipping school. Tom's way of dealing with it isn't working." The irony wasn't lost on Judge Wilson. He was the wife of the man who had profiled him, asking for help with their son, help that Judge Wilson had provided for countless other families over the years. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed. Mrs. Green had sent a text. "Chief Thomas on line 1. Urgent." "Excuse me a moment," he said, picking up the phone. The chief's voice was tense. "Judge, we have a situation. The body cam footage from last night was leaked online about 20 minutes ago. It's going viral." Judge Wilson closed his eyes briefly. "Who leaked it?" "We're investigating, but that's not all. People are gathering at the police station. It's peaceful so far, but growing." "I'll be there in 10 minutes," Judge Wilson decided. "Don't make any statements until I arrive." He hung up and looked at Mrs. Turner, who seemed to sense that something had changed. "The body camera footage has been leaked," he explained. "People are gathering at the police station." Her face paled. "There will be protests." "Yes," Judge Wilson agreed. "But maybe that's not a bad thing. People should be upset about injustice. The question is what we do with that energy." He stood straightening his tie. "Mrs. Turner, about your son, bring him to the community center on Saturday morning. 10 o'clock. We'll talk then." For his father's actions. Neither are you. He grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to try to make sure this situation doesn't spiral out of control." 20 minutes later, Judge Wilson stood on the steps of the police station addressing a crowd that had swelled to nearly 100 people. Behind him stood Chief Thomas, the mayor, and, to everyone's surprise, Officer Ramirez. "I understand your anger," Judge Wilson told the crowd. "I felt it too, last night when I was pulled from my car and treated like a criminal in my own neighborhood." A murmur ran through the gathering. Someone shouted, "Fire Turner." Judge Wilson held up his hand. "Officer Turner has been suspended, and there will be a full investigation into his conduct. But this isn't about one officer. This is about something deeper." He looked out at the faces before him, young and old, black, white, brown, united in their outrage. Among them stood Mrs. Puttoll with her arm around her son, Mr. Lee with his grandson, court clerks, lawyers, teachers from the high school, and dozens of ordinary citizens who had never set foot in his courtroom. "Today, I'm announcing the formation of a Police Community Oversight Board. This board will have real power to review complaints, recommend policy changes, and hold officers accountable. Officer Ramirez has volunteered to serve as a liaison." A cheer went up from the crowd. "But that's just the beginning," Judge Wilson continued. "We need to look at the whole system, how we train officers, how we respond to complaints, how we build trust between law enforcement and the people they serve." The mayor stepped forward. "Judge Wilson has agreed to head this initiative. The town council has pledged its full support." As Judge Wilson surveyed the crowd, he spotted Mrs. Turner standing at the back, watching. Their eyes met briefly, and she gave a small nod. What had begun as a humiliating traffic stop was becoming something none of them had expected, a chance for real change. Judge Wilson felt both the weight and the possibility of this moment. There would be resistance. There would be setbacks. But looking at the faces before him, he also saw hope. "Let's get to work," he told them. Stacks of paper. He had spent every spare moment researching police reform initiatives from across the country. Some had worked, many had failed, and the differences often came down to the details. His wife knocked gently on the doorframe. "You've been in here for hours," she said, setting a mug of tea on his desk. "The news is talking about you again." Judge Wilson rubbed his tired eyes. "What are they saying now?" "That you're being considered for a federal appointment, that the governor called, that you're planning to run for mayor." She smiled. Everyone has an opinion about what you should do next. He shook his head. Everyone except me. The truth was, Judge Wilson stood at a crossroads. The incident had thrust him into the spotlight in a way his years on the bench never had. His phone was filled with messages from civil rights organizations asking him to speak at events, from politicians seeking his endorsement, from publishers offering book deals. But a different message weighed on his mind, a handwritten letter from a 14-year-old boy he'd never met. "Dear Judge Wilson, my dad got pulled over last month just like you did. But nobody cared because he's not important. He lost his job because they found a warrant for an old parking ticket and he missed his shift. We might lose our apartment now. Can you help people like us too, not just yourself?" The boy had signed his name and included his family's phone number. That letter, more than all the media attention, had kept Judge Wilson awake at night. His wife sat on the edge of his desk. "You've been quiet since that meeting with the mayor yesterday. What happened?" Judge Wilson sighed. "They want me to head a commission. Blue ribbon panel, media appearances, the works. It would look good, sound impressive." "But," she prompted. "But it wouldn't change anything. Not really." He picked up the boy's letter. "Not for this family or the hundreds like them." His wife nodded. She had been his moral compass for 30 years, the person who knew him better than anyone. "So what will?" Before he could answer, the doorbell rang. His wife went to answer it, returning moments later with Officer Turner. Judge Wilson stood surprised. "Officer, I wasn't expecting you." Turner looked different out of uniform, smaller somehow, less certain. "I won't stay long." He swallowed hard. "My wife said she spoke to you. About our son." "She did," Judge Wilson confirmed. Turner's hands fidgeted at his sides. "They're reviewing all my stops now. 10 years on the force, every traffic stop, every arrest. They'll find patterns." "I know they will." Judge Wilson said nothing. There was no point denying what they both knew to be true. "I could fight it," Turner continued. "Police union would back me. I could claim it's a witch hunt. Is that why you're here? To tell me you're fighting back?" "My boy needs help, and you run that program, and I don't have the right to ask you for anything, but my wife says you said he could come," and he trailed off, looking lost. Judge Wilson studied the man before him. 3 days ago, Turner had looked at him and seen only his skin color. Now he was seeing the human being, a respected judge, a community leader, perhaps even someone who could help his family. Saturday morning, 10 o'clock, Judge Wilson confirmed. "He's welcome." Relief washed over Turner's face. "Thank you. And I want you to know I've requested to be part of whatever retraining comes out of this. I don't want to be this person anymore." After Turner left, Judge Wilson returned to his study, mind clearer than it had been in days. He picked up the phone and dialed the number from the boy's letter. A woman answered, skeptical at first, then stunned as she realized who was calling. "Judge Wilson, why are you calling us?" "Your son wrote to me," he explained, "about your family's situation. I'd like to help if I can." There was a pause, then a muffled sound that might have been crying. Nobody's ever offered to help before. By midnight, Judge Wilson had made his decision. He drafted a letter declining the mayor's offer to lead the commission. Instead, he outlined his own plan. He would take a temporary leave from the bench to establish a community justice center. The center would offer legal aid to families affected by unfair policing, provide mediation between citizens and law enforcement, and create a transparent system for tracking and addressing complaints. He would start with one family, the boy who wrote him the letter, and build from there. No cameras, no press conferences, just the quiet work of addressing one injustice at a time. His wife found him asleep at his desk, the finished proposal under his hand. She covered him with a blanket and turned out the light, knowing that tomorrow would mark the beginning of something important, not just for their town, but for her husband's journey as well. When morning came, Judge Wilson would make the calls that would change the course of his career. But for now, he slept more soundly than he had in years, certain in his purpose. Had become the busiest place in town. What had started with a single family, the boy who wrote the letter and his father, had grown into something no one could have predicted. Judge Wilson stood by the window, watching people come and go. A grandmother bringing cookies to thank the volunteer lawyers. A teenager arriving for his mentoring session. A police officer, in uniform, stopping by to check on a case she had referred. Coffee? Mrs. Patel appeared at his side, offering a steaming cup. She had left her paralegal job to help run the center, saying it was the most meaningful work she'd ever done. Thanks, Judge Wilson said, taking the cup. Busy day ahead. 3 mediation sessions, 2 Know Your Rights workshops, and that town hall meeting tonight, she replied. Oh, and Turner called. He wants to know if he can bring 2 more officers to the sensitivity training next week. Judge Wilson nodded. Tell him yes. Of all the surprises of the past 6 months, Officer Turner's transformation had been among the most remarkable. After his review had resulted in a demotion rather than firing, Turner had thrown himself into reform efforts with unexpected passion. He now led a group of officers committed to changing police culture from within. The bell over the door jingled, and a familiar face walked in, the mayor, looking characteristically uncomfortable in this part of town. Judge Wilson, he called out. Got a minute? They stepped into the small office at the back of the center, walls covered with community artwork and thank you letters. The council approved your funding proposal, the mayor announced without preamble. Full amount, unanimous vote. Judge Wilson's eyebrows rose. Unanimous. Even Councilman Hayes. Even Hayes. The mayor shook his head in wonder. He said, and I quote, sometimes you have to admit when something works. The funding would allow the Justice Center to expand its services, hire more staff, and perhaps most importantly, replicate the model in neighboring communities. What had begun as one man's response to a humiliating traffic stop was becoming a blueprint for change. There's something else, the mayor added, looking less comfortable now. The governor's office called again. They want you to head the state's new police oversight commission. Judge Wilson had turned down 3 such offers in the past 6 months. Each time, he'd said the same thing, I'm needed here. I know what you're going to say, the mayor continued. But hear me out. This commission will have real teeth, setting standards that apply to every department in the state. What you've built here could be scaled up, could help thousands of people instead of hundreds. Before Judge Wilson could respond, there was a knock at the door. It was the teenage boy who had written him that letter half a year ago. Sorry to interrupt, the boy said. But my dad's case got resolved. The judge threw out the warrant and the arrest. He's starting his new job tomorrow. Judge Wilson smiled. That's great news. The boy shifted from foot to foot. I just wanted to say thanks. Nobody ever listened to us before. After the boy left, the mayor cleared his throat. That's what I'm talking about. Imagine doing that on a state level. Judge Wilson looked thoughtful. I need to think about it. Later that evening, the community center gymnasium was packed for the town hall meeting. People from all walks of life filled the seats. Families affected by police misconduct, officers committed to change, community leaders, and ordinary citizens who simply wanted a safer town. Judge Wilson stood at the podium, looking out at faces that had become familiar over the past 6 months. In the front row sat his wife, beaming with pride. Beside her was Mrs. Turner with her teenage son, who had blossomed in the mentorship program. Officer Ramirez, now promoted to sergeant, sat with a group of young officers. Even Lieutenant Baker was there, initially skeptical but gradually won over by the results he'd seen. 6 months ago, Judge Wilson began, I stood in front of the police station, angry about what had happened to me. I thought this would be about holding one officer accountable, about my personal dignity. About one traffic stop or one judge or one officer. This was about a system that needed to change and a community brave enough to do the changing. He gestured to the presentation screen behind him, where statistics told a compelling story. Complaints down by 40%. Use of force incidents reduced by half. Community satisfaction with police up by 60%. These numbers matter, he continued. But what matters more are the stories behind them. The father who kept his job because an officer exercised discretion instead of making an unnecessary arrest. The teenager who joined our youth council instead of a gang because an officer reached out with respect instead of suspicion. The elderly woman who now waves to patrol cars instead of fearing them. Judge Wilson looked directly at Officer Turner, who sat in the back row. Their eyes met in a moment of understanding that needed no words. Change doesn't happen from the top down. It happens in daily interactions, in moments when we choose to see each other's humanity. It happens when we're brave enough to admit our mistakes and humble enough to learn from them. As Judge Wilson concluded his remarks, the room erupted in applause. People rose to their feet, not just clapping but embracing one another across divisions that had once seemed unbridgeable. Later that night, walking home with his wife under a sky full of stars, Judge Wilson had his answer about the governor's offer. "I'm going to take it," he told her. "But on one condition, that we bring this model with us, that we build it from the ground up with the people most affected at the table." She squeezed his hand. From one traffic stop to state policy, not bad for 6 months' work. Judge Wilson smiled. "It's just the beginning."